In the year 1254, in the floating marble city of Venice, a child was born who would travel farther from home than any European before him, witness wonders that would strain the credulity of his age, and return with tales so extraordinary that his own countrymen would brand him a liar. His name was Marco Polo, and the journey that would consume 24 years of his life, 17 of them in service to the most powerful ruler on earth, would reshape Europe's understanding of the world beyond its borders. But that understanding would come at a price measured not merely in years of exile, but in the profound alienation of a man who had lived too long between worlds to belong fully to either. Our guide through this extraordinary odyssey is Marco himself, or rather the book he would dictate while imprisoned in a Genoese jail, Il Milione, as his contemporaries called it, perhaps because they believed it contained a million lies. The work emerged from an unlikely collaboration between the Venetian traveler and a romance writer named Rustichello da Pisa, who possessed the literary skill to transform Marco's memories into prose. While we must acknowledge that this account was filtered through the conventions of medieval storytelling and the fading recollections of an aging man, modern scholarship has confirmed the essential accuracy of most details. Chinese records corroborate much of what Marco claimed to have witnessed, and archaeological evidence supports his descriptions of cities, customs, and trade routes. Where discrepancies exist, they often reveal as much about the limitations of medieval understanding as about any failure of memory or honesty. Marco Polo entered the world in a Venice that was already drunk on the possibilities of distant trade. The city rose from its lagoon like a fever dream of marble and gold, its palaces built on foundations of salt and ambition. Venice in the 13th century was not merely a city, but a commercial empire, its merchants ranging across the Mediterranean and beyond in pursuit of the spices, silks, and precious goods that flowed along the ancient trade routes connecting east and west. The air itself seemed thick with possibility, and the scent of exotic cargo, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, silk from distant Cathay. In the Rialto, the city's commercial heart, languages mixed like waters from different rivers, Arabic and Greek, Armenian and Persian, all flowing together in the universal tongue of commerce. Into this world of merchants and mariners was born Marco, son of Niccolo Polo and nephew to Maffeo. The Polo family belonged to Venice's merchant class, not the ancient nobility who traced their lineages to the city's founding, but the energetic traders who had built their fortunes through intelligence, courage, and an appetite for risk that bordered on recklessness. They were jewel merchants by trade, dealing in the precious stones that served as both ornament and portable wealth in an age when a handful of emeralds might represent a family's entire fortune. Marco's childhood was shaped by absence. When he was 6 years old, his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo departed Venice on what they intended as a routine trading expedition to the eastern reaches of the Mediterranean. They carried with them a cargo of jewels and the expectation of returning within a year or two, their purses heavy with profit. But the brothers Polo possessed an unusual combination of commercial acumen and wanderlust that would prove both their making and their curse. As political upheavals closed familiar routes, they pushed ever eastward, following opportunities that beckoned from beyond each successive horizon. Their journey took them first to Constantinople, that golden hinge between Europe and Asia where the last emperors of Byzantium maintained their precarious rule. From there they traveled to the Crimea, then into the wild steppes of Russia, following trade routes that few Europeans had ever attempted. War erupted behind them. The familiar conflicts between Byzantium and the emerging powers of the region, cutting off their path home. Faced with the choice between waiting in safety for the conflicts to resolve or pushing deeper into unknown territories, the Polo brothers chose adventure. They joined a caravan crossing the Central Asian deserts, their Venetian clothes growing threadbare under the relentless sun, their skin darkening to leather as they adapted to a nomadic existence their merchant fathers could never have imagined. For 3 years they traveled deeper into Asia, trading jewels for local goods, learning languages, adapting to customs that would have seemed alien in the marble halls of Venice. They were no longer merely merchants. They had become something rarer and more valuable, bridges between worlds. Their wanderings eventually brought them to the court of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and ruler of an empire that stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. The Khan, curious about these strange foreigners who had traveled so far from their homeland, received them with honors and questioned them closely about their faith, their customs, and the lands beyond his borders. The Mongol Empire, despite its reputation for brutality and conquest, proved remarkably tolerant of foreign ways and eager to absorb useful knowledge from any source. Kublai Khan was particularly intrigued by Christianity, not necessarily as a faith he might adopt, but as a political and cultural force he needed to understand. When the Polo brothers finally prepared to depart for home after years in the Khan's service, they carried with them gifts of immeasurable value, not merely gold and jewels, but letters from the most powerful ruler in the world. Kublai Khan had commissioned them as his ambassadors to the Pope, requesting that 100 learned Christian scholars be sent to his court to engage in theological discussions. More importantly for the Polo family's future, the Khan had expressed his desire to see the brothers return, bringing with them detailed accounts of the Christian lands and, if possible, some of the holy oil from the lamp that burned at Christ's tomb in Jerusalem. The journey home consumed another 3 years. When Niccolò and Maffeo Polo finally stood once again in the Piazza San Marco in 1269, they had been absent for 9 years. The Venice they returned to seemed simultaneously smaller and more familiar than memory had painted it. The same merchants argued over prices in the same stalls. The same bells rang the same hours. The same tides lifted and lowered the same boats. But the brothers themselves had been fundamentally changed. They had eaten with emperors and slept under stars in deserts whose names appeared on no European map. They carried within their memories images of cities more magnificent than anything in Christendom and knowledge of trade routes that could make Venice incalculably wealthy. For young Marco, now 15 years old, the return of his father and uncle must have seemed like the arrival of figures from legend. Here were men who had traveled beyond the edge of the known world and lived to tell of it. They brought with them not merely exotic gifts, though the house of Polo suddenly displayed treasures that made their neighbors stare, but stories that fired the imagination. Marco had spent his adolescence in the care of his mother and extended family, learning the merchant's trade through the traditional apprenticeships of Venice. He could calculate exchange rates, evaluate the quality of gems, and navigate the complex web of credit and obligation that bound the city's commercial life together. But as he listened to his father and uncle recount their adventures, he understood that the skills he had mastered were merely preparation for something infinitely grander. The Polo brothers found a Venice changed by their absence, and a Christian world grappling with upheavals that would shape Marco's future journey. Pope Clement IV had died in 1268, and the papal throne remained vacant as cardinals struggled to agree on a successor. This posed a significant problem for the Polo family's diplomatic mission. Kublai Khan's letter required a papal response, but there was no pope to provide one. The brothers waited, growing increasingly restless as months passed without resolution. The treasures they had carried from Cathay dwindled as they were converted to support daily life. More troubling still, the trading opportunities they had identified required immediate action. Every day of delay meant profits flowing to competitors. By 1271, with the papal election still deadlocked, the Polo brothers could wait no longer. They decided to return to the Khan's court, papal response or not. But this time, they would not travel alone. Niccolò had decided to bring his son Marco, now 17, and burning with curiosity about the wonders his father had described. The decision would transform the boy's life in ways none of them could have anticipated, setting him on a path that would lead to fame, exile, and a kind of immortality built from words and memories. The physical preparations for departure revealed the magnitude of their undertaking. Venice's merchants were accustomed to ambitious journeys, expeditions to Alexandria, Constantinople, even the ports of the Black Sea. But what the Polos contemplated was something else entirely. a journey that would take them through deserts and mountain passes where European feet had rarely trod, across cultures so alien that basic assumptions about human behavior would prove unreliable, into the heart of an empire whose size exceeded Europe's capacity to comprehend. They gathered supplies with the methodical care of men who understood that their lives might depend on a single overlooked necessity: food that would not spoil during months of travel, salted meat, hardtack, dried fruits, tools for repair and maintenance of equipment. Weapons, though they would depend more on diplomacy than force for protection. Trade goods carefully chosen for their value-to-weight ratio and their appeal to markets they could only guess at. Most crucially, they assembled gifts appropriate for presentation to rulers whose customs they understood imperfectly, but whose favor they would need absolutely. The selection of their route required careful consideration of political realities that shifted like sand dunes in the desert wind. The traditional paths eastward through Constantinople and the Black Sea were periodically disrupted by warfare between Byzantium and the emerging Ottoman powers. Alternative routes through the Arab lands of the eastern Mediterranean carried their own risks, not merely from bandits and natural hazards, but from the complex web of alliances and enmities that could transform a peaceful passage into a death trap overnight. They decided to travel overland through the Levant to the port of Acre, one of the last Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land. From there, they would strike inland, following caravan routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the vast inland seas of Central Asia. This path would take them through Persia, across the high passes of the Hindu Kush, and into the burning emptiness of the Gobi Desert. It was a route that claimed lives routinely, where entire caravans vanished without trace, where the margin between survival and death was measured in days of water and the reliability of local guides. As their departure date approached, Marco found himself experiencing emotions he had no words for. Venice had been his entire world, its narrow canals and soaring campaniles, its markets redolent with spices and alive with polyglot chatter, its palaces rising from the water like crystallized dreams of wealth and power. He had walked every district, knew every church and monastery, could navigate by moonlight through neighborhoods where others would lose their way in broad daylight. The city was woven into his identity so completely that leaving it felt like severing part of his soul. Yet the prospect of remaining behind while his father and uncle embarked on their second great adventure was unthinkable. Marco had tasted enough of merchant life to understand its limitations. Yes, Venice offered opportunities for wealth and status that peasants in other lands could never dream of. But those opportunities came with boundaries: geographic, cultural, imaginative. A successful Venetian merchant might own palaces and command fleets, but his world remained fundamentally circumscribed by the familiar rhythms of European commerce. What his father and uncle offered was something far rarer: the chance to step beyond the borders of the known world entirely, to see wonders that no European had ever described, to participate in events that would echo through history. The night before their departure, Marco walked alone through the streets of his native city, trying to memorize details he had always taken for granted. The way morning light fell across the Piazza San Marco, turning the basilica's mosaics into panels of liquid gold. The particular echo of footsteps on the stone bridges that arched over dark canals. The smell of bread baking in the pre-dawn hours, when the city seemed to hold its breath before beginning another day of frantic commercial activity. He was 17 years old, possessed of an intelligence sharpened by mercantile training and an imagination inflamed by his father's tales. He could not have known that he was storing up memories that would sustain him through decades of exile, or that these familiar sights would grow precious in retrospection as they faded beyond any hope of recovery. The morning of departure dawned clear and cool, with a breeze from the Adriatic that filled the sails of ships bound for distant ports. The Polo family gathered at the wharf where their passage had been arranged, their possessions reduced to what could be carried on pack horses and camels. Marco's mother wept, not merely from sorrow at parting, but from a presentiment that this separation might prove permanent. She had already lost her husband for 9 years. Now she was losing her son for an indefinite period, watching him disappear into stories whose endings no one could predict. The ship that would carry them on the first stage of their journey was typical of Mediterranean commerce, a galley designed for both cargo and passengers, its hold packed with goods bound for the markets of the Levant. Marco watched Venice's skyline recede across the widening water, the familiar domes and towers growing smaller until they merged with the haze on the horizon. He was leaving behind not merely a city, but an entire way of understanding the world. Everything that followed would be measured against this moment of departure, when the known gave way to the unknown, and a Venetian boy began his transformation into something unprecedented, a European who would spend the majority of his adult life as an Asian. The passage to Acre took 2 weeks, during which Marco experienced his first taste of the hardships that would define the years ahead. The Mediterranean, for all its familiar place in Venetian commerce, could be treacherous even for experienced mariners. Storms rose without warning, transforming the sea from a highway of trade into a chaos of wind and water that threatened to swallow ships without trace. Marco, who had never been to sea for more than day trips around the Venetian lagoon, discovered that his body rebelled against the constant motion. Seasickness reduced him to misery, leaving him weak and nauseated as the ship pitched through heavy swells. But even as his body suffered, his mind remained alert to the wonders around him. The Mediterranean at night was unlike anything he had experienced in Venice's protected waters, a vast darkness punctuated by points of starlight that seemed to dance on the waves. During calm periods, dolphins played in the ship's wake, their sleek bodies cutting through phosphorescent water that glowed like scattered jewels. Flying fish launched themselves from wave to wave in silver arcs that defied everything Marco thought he knew about the natural world. These were his first glimpses of the strangeness that lay beyond European borders, hints of the marvels that would soon overwhelm his capacity for wonder. The port of Acre, when it finally appeared on the horizon, represented both destination and beginning. One of the last footholds of the Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land, it served as a crucial link between the Mediterranean world and the caravan routes that stretched into Asia. The city's walls rose directly from the sea, their massive stones scarred by centuries of siege and assault. Within those walls, East and West mingled in ways that Venice, for all its cosmopolitan character, had never achieved. Here were Frankish knights and Arab merchants, Armenian traders and Syrian craftsmen, all united in the pursuit of profit that transcended religious and cultural boundaries. Marco's first steps on Asian soil, for Acre, technically speaking, stood at the boundary between Europe and Asia, marked a threshold he could not fully comprehend. He was no longer merely a Venetian traveling to distant markets, but a European venturing into realms where his most basic assumptions would prove inadequate. The languages spoken in Acre's markets included dialects he had never heard. The goods displayed came from regions whose names existed only in the vaguest European legends, and the customs governing daily life reflected understandings of the world that would challenge everything he thought he knew about human nature and divine intention. As the Polo family prepared for the next stage of their journey, the overland passage through territories where European authority meant nothing and European protection did not exist, Marco began to understand the magnitude of what they had undertaken. This was not merely a trading expedition that happened to range farther from home than most, but something qualitatively different, an expedition into the unknown that would test every skill they possessed and demand capabilities they did not yet know they had. The familiar certainties of Venetian life were already becoming memories. What lay ahead was a blank map that they would fill through their own experience, creating knowledge where none had existed before. The caravan they joined at Acre included merchants from a dozen different lands, each group contributing specialized knowledge essential for survival in the harsh territories ahead. Persian traders brought expertise in desert navigation and the complex protocols governing safe passage through tribal territories. Armenian merchants, masters of the overland routes between the Black Sea and the Indian Ocean, shared their understanding of the seasonal rhythms that determined when mountain passes could be crossed safely. Arab guides carried detailed knowledge of water sources and seasonal grazing grounds that could mean the difference between life and death in regions where a single miscalculation might doom an entire expedition. Marco found himself thrust into a cosmopolitan community unlike anything he had experienced in Venice. These men spoke multiple languages as a matter of survival, switching effortlessly between Arabic and Persian, Turkish and Armenian, as circumstances demanded. They possessed skills that no European merchant needed: the ability to read weather patterns in desert skies, to judge the quality of pack animals by subtle signs invisible to untrained eyes, to negotiate with tribal chieftains whose concepts of honor and obligation bore little resemblance to European commercial law. Most importantly, they understood that beyond the borders of settled civilization, survival depended on cooperation and mutual aid that transcended the competitive individualism of urban markets. As they departed Acre and struck inland toward the passes that would carry them over the mountains of Armenia, Marco experienced his first taste of the physical hardships that would define the journey ahead. The roads, where roads existed at all, were often little more than paths beaten by centuries of caravans, winding through landscapes that seemed designed to test human endurance. The heat during the day was crushing, a weight of sun and sand that drained strength from men and animals alike. At night, temperatures plummeted with shocking suddenness, leaving travelers shivering in their blankets as they huddled around fires built from scrub brush and dried dung. The animals that carried their supplies, horses, mules, and the invaluable camels whose endurance made such journeys possible, required constant attention. Each morning brought the same routine: inspection of hooves for cuts or embedded stones, examination of pack saddles for signs of chafing that could cripple a beast within hours, careful rationing of water and fodder that represented the difference between success and catastrophe. Marco, who had never managed anything more complicated than a merchant's ledger, found himself learning skills that would have been meaningless in Venice but were essential for survival in the wastelands they now traversed. The human dynamics of caravan travel proved equally challenging. Men who had lived their entire lives within settled communities discovered that the rules governing social interaction changed dramatically when survival depended on collective effort. Personal disputes that might have been resolved through legal action in Venice required different solutions when the nearest authority lay weeks of travel behind or ahead. The caravan developed its own culture, its own hierarchy, its own methods for resolving conflicts and distributing scarce resources. Marco, as the youngest member of the expedition and a complete novice in the skills that mattered most, found himself occupying the lowest rung of this hierarchy, dependent on the goodwill and expertise of men whose backgrounds and motivations he was only beginning to understand. Yet even as the journey tested his physical endurance and challenged his preconceptions about human society, Marco began to experience wonders that more than compensated for the hardships. The landscapes they traveled through possessed a savage beauty, unlike anything in Europe's gentle countryside. Mountain ranges rose like walls against the sky, their peaks crowned with snow that gleamed like crystal in the thin air of high altitude. Desert vistas stretched to horizons that seemed impossibly distant, their emptiness broken only by the occasional oasis where palm trees clustered around springs of water so precious that entire trade routes had been organized around their protection. At night, in regions where no human lights competed with celestial illumination, stars crowded the sky in such profusion that Marco could understand why ancient peoples had seen in them the handwriting of gods. The cities they encountered along their route provided his first glimpse of civilizations that owed nothing to European models. These were not merely exotic variations on familiar themes, but societies organized around principles that challenged his most basic assumptions about human nature and divine will. Architecture that soared toward the heaven in forms his eyes could barely comprehend, incorporating mathematical principles that European builders had never mastered. Markets where goods from regions he had never heard of changed hands according to commercial practices that revealed the limitations of Venetian methods. Religious ceremonies that honored the divine through rituals so alien that he could not even identify their underlying logic, yet which clearly moved their participants to heights of spiritual exaltation. Most profound of all were the encounters with peoples whose very existence challenged European assumptions about the diversity of human experience. In the markets of Tabriz, Marco watched Persian merchants conduct business with a sophistication that made Venetian commercial practices seem crude by comparison. They employed mathematical concepts unknown in Europe, calculated exchange rates across multiple currencies with mental agility that left him struggling to follow their reasoning, and maintained commercial relationships across distances that spanned continents through systems of credit and obligation that operated entirely on trust and reputation. These were not the barbarians that European chronicles had led him to expect, but civilized peoples whose knowledge in many areas exceeded anything available in Christendom. The religious diversity he encountered proved equally challenging to his European understanding of divine truth. In Armenia, he witnessed Christian ceremonies that bore only passing resemblance to the Roman practices he knew, conducted by priests whose theological interpretations had evolved in isolation from papal authority for centuries. Their churches, carved directly into living rock, contained iconography that told familiar biblical stories through artistic conventions that seemed to spring from entirely different aesthetic traditions. The very stone seemed to breathe with a spirituality that was unmistakably Christian, yet utterly foreign to his Venetian experience. Beyond Armenia lay regions where Christianity gave way to faiths he had barely heard of. Persian fire temples where priests tended flames that had supposedly burned for centuries, their rituals designed to honor the eternal conflict between light and darkness. Islamic mosques where the faithful prostrated themselves toward Mecca in displays of collective devotion that moved him despite his inability to comprehend their theological foundations. Buddhist monasteries perched on mountain peaks where monks pursued enlightenment through meditation practices that seemed to offer direct communion with the divine without any need for ecclesiastical intermediaries. Each encounter forced Marco to expand his understanding of what human beings were capable of believing, achieving, and becoming. The confident certainties of his Venetian upbringing about the superiority of Christian civilization, about the natural order of social hierarchies, about the proper relationship between earthly and spiritual authority, crumbled gradually as he witnessed societies that functioned according to entirely different principles yet achieved levels of prosperity, learning, and artistic achievement that rivaled or exceeded anything in Europe. The physical journey itself became a kind of education that no European university could have provided. Desert travel taught him to read the subtle signs that distinguished a reliable water source from a mirage, to judge the condition of pack animals by observing their gait and breathing, to navigate by stars whose patterns were unknown to European astronomers. Mountain passages revealed the techniques necessary for surviving at altitudes where the air itself seemed too thin to sustain life, how to recognize the symptoms of altitude sickness before they became dangerous, how to pace one's breathing and movement to conserve strength in the oxygen-starved environment, how to protect exposed skin from solar radiation that could burn flesh to blistering ruin in hours. The social dynamics of caravan life provided equally valuable lessons. Marco learned to sleep lightly, always alert for the sounds that might indicate approaching danger. The distant thunder of hoofbeats that could signal bandits or tribal warriors, the particular quality of silence that often preceded sandstorms or other natural disasters. He discovered the importance of maintaining good relations with every member of the expedition, from the most experienced guides to the lowliest camel drivers, since survival might depend on any one of them at crucial moments. Most importantly, he began to understand that the hierarchies he had taken for granted in Venice, based on birth, wealth, and social position, meant nothing in circumstances where a man's value was determined solely by his contribution to collective survival. As weeks stretched into months and the caravan pushed deeper into territories that appeared on no European map, Marco began to experience a profound transformation of identity. The comfortable categories that had defined him in Venice, Polo family member, merchant apprentice, Venetian citizen, seemed increasingly irrelevant to his daily reality. He was becoming something unprecedented, a European who was learning to think and act according to Asian principles, to navigate social situations using skills developed through cross-cultural necessity rather than inherited tradition. The linguistic challenges alone required a complete reorganization of his mental habits. In Venice, he had been fluent in the Venetian dialect, competent in Latin, and familiar with enough Greek and Arabic to conduct basic commercial transactions, but the languages he encountered on the caravan route demanded different kinds of cognitive flexibility. Persian required him to master grammatical structures that bore no resemblance to European models. Turkish incorporated sounds that his Italian-trained tongue could barely pronounce. Most challenging of all, effective communication often depended less on formal linguistic competence than on the ability to interpret gesture, context, and cultural nuance, skills that could only be developed through constant practice and frequent failure. The religious implications of his journey posed equally complex challenges. Marco remained a devout Christian throughout his travels, but his understanding of what that identity meant underwent constant revision as he encountered peoples whose own spiritual traditions revealed the limitations of European theological assumptions. In Persia, he met Nestorian Christians whose ancient communities had preserved Christian traditions unknown in the West, their practices shaped by centuries of coexistence with Islamic and Zoroastrian neighbors. Their churches contained relics of saints he had never heard of. Their liturgies incorporated elements that seemed to draw from multiple spiritual traditions, and their theological discussions revealed depths of scholarly sophistication that challenged his assumptions about the relationship between geographic isolation and intellectual development. Even more troubling to his European sensibilities were encounters with non-Christian peoples whose moral behavior and spiritual depth seemed to exceed that of many Christians he had known. Buddhist monks, whose dedication to compassion and wisdom manifested in daily practices of extraordinary generosity and patience. Islamic scholars whose mastery of philosophy, mathematics, and natural science far exceeded anything taught in European schools. Zoroastrian priests whose ethical teachings emphasized truth-telling and charitable behavior in ways that seemed to echo Christian values while springing from entirely different theological foundations. These encounters forced Marco to grapple with questions that European theologians had rarely been compelled to address. Could divine truth manifest through non-Christian traditions? Did God's grace operate beyond the boundaries of the church? Were there paths to salvation that did not require acceptance of Christian doctrine? His answers to these questions would remain private. Expressing such doubts openly might have been considered heretical. But the questions themselves transformed his understanding of his own faith and its place in the larger tapestry of human spiritual experience. The commercial education he received proved equally revolutionary. Venetian merchants were accustomed to thinking in terms of Mediterranean markets where familiar goods changed hands according to well-established practices. But the trade networks he encountered in Asia operated on scales and according to principles that dwarfed European commerce. Silk produced in distant Chinese provinces traveled thousands of miles to reach markets in the Islamic heartland. Spices grown on islands whose names existed only in legend passed through dozens of intermediaries before reaching the warehouses of Persian merchants. Precious stones mined in regions that no European had ever visited became components in jewelry worn by rulers whose empires exceeded the size of all Europe combined. More striking still was the sophistication of the financial instruments that made such long-distance trade possible. Credit arrangements that allowed merchants to deposit funds in one city and withdraw them months later in locations thousands of miles away, all without physically transporting precious metals across dangerous territories. Insurance systems that distributed the risks of caravan trade among multiple parties, ensuring that no single loss could destroy a merchant's livelihood. Standardized weights and measures that enabled accurate transactions between peoples who shared no common language or legal tradition. These systems revealed the existence of a commercial civilization that operated according to principles more advanced than anything available in Europe. The Venetian merchants who dominated Mediterranean trade were sophisticated by European standards, but their methods seemed primitive compared to the networks that connected Asian markets. Marco began to understand that his family's expedition was not merely an adventure into unknown territories, but an entry into economic systems that could transform Venice's commercial prospects if properly understood and exploited. The physical toll of the journey continued to mount as the caravan pushed through regions where the very landscape seemed hostile to human survival. The deserts of Persia stretched endlessly under skies that seemed to press down like molten metal, their surfaces broken only by rock formations that provided no shelter and occasional oases that supported brief moments of relief before giving way to more miles of emptiness. The sun during these desert crossings became an enemy more dangerous than any human adversary, a source of heat so intense that it could kill through dehydration and exposure within hours of protective shelter being lost. Water, the most precious commodity in such environments, dominated every aspect of daily routine. The caravan's survival depended on the guide's intimate knowledge of where reliable sources could be found, and even the most experienced travelers carried anxiety about whether the next known well would prove dry or contaminated. Marco learned to ration his consumption with the discipline of a monk, to recognize the early symptoms of dehydration before they became dangerous, and to appreciate the life-giving properties of liquid that in Venice he had taken completely for granted. The nights brought different challenges, but equal discomfort. Desert temperatures could plummet by 50 degrees or more after sunset, leaving travelers who had been gasping in overwhelming heat suddenly shivering in conditions that threatened frostbite. The contrast was so extreme that men could suffer simultaneously from sunburn and exposure injuries, their bodies unable to adapt quickly enough to the radical temperature swings. Sleep became a precious commodity, interrupted by the need to tend fires, check on animals, and maintain watches against the bandits who haunted such routes. Yet even in these harsh environments, Marco continued to encounter wonders that compensated for the suffering. Desert nights revealed stars in such profusion that the sky seemed crowded with light, constellations wheeling overhead in patterns that guided navigation across trackless wastes. Dawn and sunset painted the endless landscapes in colors that seemed too vivid for earthly skies, purples and golds and crimsons that transformed desolation into beauty. Oases, when they finally appeared, seemed like glimpses of paradise, their palm groves and clear springs creating pockets of life and shade that offered psychological renewal alongside physical refreshment. The mountain passages presented different but equally severe challenges. High-altitude travel demanded physical adjustments that could not be hurried. The body required time to adapt to air so thin that simple exertion became exhausting. Marco experienced the headaches, nausea, and disorientation that accompanied altitude sickness, learning to recognize these symptoms and pace his activities accordingly. The cold at high elevations could be as dangerous as desert heat, with temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes and winds that cut through clothing like knives. The technical challenges of mountain travel required skills that no European education provided. Pack animals had to be managed with extraordinary care, since a single misstep could send a loaded mule tumbling down precipices that would destroy both animal and cargo. Paths that seemed stable could prove treacherous when weather conditions changed, turning routine passages into death traps without warning. Snow blindness from reflected sunlight at high altitudes could incapacitate travelers for days, leaving them helpless in environments where such vulnerability often proved fatal. But the mountain regions also provided their own compensations for hardship endured. Views from high passes revealed landscapes of such grandeur that they seemed to belong more to the realm of divine creation than earthly geography. Valleys spread out below like green tapestries, their rivers gleaming like silver threads in the distance. Snow-capped peaks stretched to horizons that seemed impossibly distant, their summits catching light in ways that transformed ordinary rock and ice into something that belonged in visions rather than physical reality. The peoples they encountered in these high regions possessed their own forms of wisdom adapted to environments that would have killed lowland dwellers within days. Their knowledge of weather patterns could predict storms hours before any visible signs appeared. Their understanding of mountain ecology allowed them to find food and fuel in landscapes that seemed utterly barren. Their social structures emphasized cooperation and mutual aid to degrees that ensured collective survival in circumstances where individualistic competition would have doomed entire communities. As the caravan descended from the high passes and entered the approaches to the greatest desert crossing of their entire journey, the feared Gobi, whose very name carried connotations of death and desolation, Marco found himself reflecting on how profoundly the journey had already changed him. The boy who had departed Venice bore little resemblance to the young man who now prepared to face the ultimate test of the overland route to Cathay. His body had been hardened by months of travel under conditions that would have seemed impossible to endure. His mind had been expanded by constant exposure to peoples, landscapes, and ideas that challenged every assumption he had brought from Europe. Most significantly, his sense of identity had begun to shift in ways that would prove irreversible. He was no longer simply a Venetian merchant traveling to distant markets, but something unprecedented. A European who was learning to see the world through Asian eyes, to understand human nature through cross-cultural experience, to appreciate the divine through encounters with spiritual traditions that his homeland had never imagined. The transformation was still incomplete. Years of travel lay ahead, but the fundamental reorientation had begun. The approach to the Gobi Desert marked a crucial threshold in their journey. Beyond this point lay territories where European influence, however tenuous, gave way entirely to Asian authority. The caravan routes they had followed through Persia and the mountain regions still carried occasional travelers from the Mediterranean world, Armenian merchants, Jewish traders, Christian missionaries. But the crossing they now contemplated would take them into realms where Europeans were so rare as to be considered almost mythological beings. The preparations for the Gobi crossing revealed the magnitude of what they were attempting. This was not merely another difficult passage, but the most dangerous stage of the entire route to Cathay, a desert so vast that caravans could travel for weeks without encountering any sign of human habitation, so barren that the death of a single pack animal could doom an entire expedition. The guides who specialized in Gobi travel were men apart even from other caravan leaders, their knowledge earned through experience that had claimed the lives of countless predecessors. The supplies required for Gobi travel exceeded anything Marco had previously imagined. Water had to be carried in quantities that strained the capacity of even the strongest camels. Food stores had to include provisions for delays that might extend the crossing by weeks beyond normal duration. Fuel for fires had to be transported since the desert offered nothing that would burn. Most crucially, the expedition had to carry enough fodder to sustain the animals that carried everything else, a circular problem that required mathematical precision to solve. The psychological preparation proved equally demanding. The Gobi was notorious not merely for its physical dangers, but for the mental toll it extracted from travelers. The emptiness was so complete, the silence so profound, that many travelers reported hallucinations and psychological breakdown. The guide spoke of phantom sounds that could lead caravans astray, drums beating in empty air, voices calling from directions where no human throat existed. Music that seemed to promise shelter where only death awaited. As they stood at the edge of this vast emptiness, preparing for a crossing that would take them beyond the boundaries of the known world, Marco understood that he was approaching a point of no return. Not merely in geographic terms, though the Gobi crossing would indeed carry them so far from European territories that retreat would become practically impossible, but in personal terms as well. The young man who emerged from the desert would bear even less resemblance to the Venetian merchant's son than the traveler who now prepared to enter it. The first steps into the Gobi marked the beginning of the most transformative phase of Marco's journey to the court of the great Khan. Here, In this vast emptiness that seemed to exist outside the normal bounds of earthly geography, he would undergo trials that would complete his metamorphosis from European youth to something unprecedented in the history of East-West contact, a bridge between worlds whose very existence would challenge the assumptions of both civilizations. The Gobi revealed itself gradually, like a secret too terrible to be exposed all at once. For the first few days, the landscape retained echoes of the world they were leaving behind. Scattered vegetation clinging to life in hollows where moisture briefly collected, the occasional bird wheeling overhead as a reminder that life persisted even here. But as the caravan pushed deeper into the desert's heart, even these tenuous connections to the living world fell away until they traveled through a realm that seemed to exist outside the normal order of creation. The silence was the most oppressive element, not merely the absence of human voices, but a quietude so complete that it seemed to press against the eardrums like a physical weight. The soft shuffle of camel feet on sand became thunderous in such emptiness. The creak of leather harness echoed like the groaning of ship timbers in a storm. Even the sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud to Marco, as if the desert amplified every noise while simultaneously swallowing it in its vastness. The heat during the day defied description. It rose from the sand in visible waves that distorted the horizon until the very air seemed to dance. Metal objects became too hot to touch. Water stored in leather containers reached temperatures that scalded the throat. The sun seemed closer here than anywhere else on Earth, a malevolent eye that watched their progress with hostile intent. Men wrapped themselves in layers of cloth until they resembled moving bundles, their faces hidden behind fabric that provided protection, but also created a sense of isolation that added psychological torment to physical discomfort. Yet it was the cold that nearly killed them. Desert nights in the Gobi plunged to temperatures that seemed impossible after the furnace of daylight. Water froze in containers, rendering it useless until the sun could restore it to liquid form. The wind that rose after sunset carried ice crystals that stung exposed skin like driven needles. Men who had gasped for relief from heat 12 hours earlier now huddled around fires built from dry dung and precious fuel, their teeth chattering as they tried to preserve enough warmth to survive until dawn. Marco learned to read the desert's moods with the intensity of a scholar studying sacred texts. The color of the morning sky could predict the ferocity of the day's heat. The direction of evening breezes foretold the severity of the coming night's cold. The behavior of the camels, their restlessness or placidity, their willingness to drink or reluctance to move, provided crucial intelligence about conditions ahead that human senses could not detect. The mirages that appeared daily became a particular torment. Lakes of impossible blue would shimmer on the horizon, complete with palm trees and the suggestion of cool shade. Cities would rise from the emptiness, their walls and towers so perfectly detailed that men would swear they could see figures moving in the streets. These visions possessed such clarity that even experienced travelers found themselves questioning their own knowledge. The guides warned constantly against pursuing such illusions, but the temptation remained overwhelming when throats burned with thirst and eyes ached from the glare of endless sand. Water dominated every waking thought. The caravan supply, carefully calculated before departure, seemed to evaporate despite the most stringent rationing. Each morning brought the anxious ritual of measuring what remained, calculating how many days of travel it might sustain, and adjusting the pace accordingly. Men began to dream of rain, of rivers, of the simple luxury of drinking until their thirst was fully satisfied. The few oases marked on their route became beacons of hope so precious that their approach was celebrated like religious festivals. When they finally reached the first major oasis, Hami, after 18 days of pure desert travel, Marco understood why ancient peoples had seen in such places the gardens of paradise. The sight of green leaves after weeks of viewing nothing but brown sand and gray rock seemed like a miracle. The sound of running water was so beautiful that grown men wept to hear it. The shade provided by date palms felt like a physical blessing, a reprieve from the sun's relentless assault that allowed both body and spirit to recover from ordeals that had pushed them to the edges of endurance. But Hami was more than mere relief. It was Marco's first encounter with the Silk Road as a living commercial reality rather than a romantic abstraction. Here, at this crossroads of desert routes, he witnessed the international trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world with the markets of distant Asia. Merchants from India displayed cotton textiles of fineness that exceeded anything produced in Europe. Persian traders offered carpets whose intricate patterns revealed mathematical principles unknown to Western weavers. Chinese caravans carried silk so lustrous and delicate that it seemed spun from crystallized light rather than the secretions of mere insects. The linguistic babble of the oasis markets provided Marco with intensive education in the polyglot nature of Asian commerce. Arabic served as the lingua franca for many transactions, but he heard Persian, Turkish, Mongolian, and languages he could not identify being used with casual fluency by merchants who switched between tongues as easily as a Venetian shopkeeper might shift between different qualities of the same merchandise. The commercial calculations involved exchange rates between currencies he had never heard of, while the trade goods themselves came from places that existed only as names in the most speculative European geographies. More intriguing still were the Chinese merchants, whose presence at Hami represented Marco's first direct contact with representatives of the civilization they were struggling to reach. These men possessed a quiet dignity that set them apart from the more boisterous traders of other nationalities. Their clothing, while practical for desert travel, showed subtle refinements of cut and fabric that spoke of sophisticated textile industries. Their commercial methods emphasized patient negotiation over aggressive bargaining, and their goods, silk, porcelain, tea, and items Marco could not identify, suggested technological capabilities that exceeded European achievements in multiple areas. The Chinese merchants examined the European visitors with curiosity that seemed tinged with skepticism. Marco realized that his party's appearance must seem as exotic to these Asian traders as theirs did to him. Their pale skin, their unfamiliar clothing, their inability to communicate in any Asian language marked them as representatives of a civilization so distant that its very existence required verification. The questions put to them through interpreters revealed how little the Chinese knew about European geography, customs, or capabilities. Marco found himself serving as an ambassador for an entire continent, trying to explain Venice and Christianity to minds that operated according to fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of reality. The month or bit they spent at Hami recovering from the first phase of desert travel and preparing for the even more challenging crossing that lay ahead provided Marco with crucial insights into the commercial possibilities that motivated his family's extraordinary journey. The goods that commanded the highest prices in these Asian markets were precisely those that were either unavailable in Europe or commanded premium prices there. Silk that cost relatively modest sums at its source would sell for fortunes in Venice. Spices that were common seasonings in Asian cooking were worth their weight in gold on European tables. Most intriguingly, there seemed to be demand for European goods that had never found their way to these markets. Woolen textiles that might appeal to peoples facing harsh winters, metalwork that incorporated techniques unknown to Asian craftsmen, and religious artifacts that might find favor with the Christian communities rumored to exist throughout the Khan's empire. The intelligence they gathered about the final stages of their journey proved both encouraging and sobering. Yes, Kublai Khan did indeed rule an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. Yes, he maintained a court of unprecedented magnificence at a city called Khanbalik, where officials from dozens of nations served an administration that governed more human beings than any ruler in history. And yes, the Khan was known to welcome foreign visitors who brought useful knowledge or skills to his service. But the distances involved were staggering even by the standards of their journey so far, and the cultural adjustments required would exceed anything they had yet experienced. The guides who specialized in the final approach to Khanbalik painted a picture of the Chinese heartland that challenged every European assumption about civilization and barbarity. This was not the primitive kingdom that European chronicles had suggested, but a realm of cities larger than anything in Christendom, of agricultural productivity that supported population densities impossible in Europe, of governmental administration that employed more officials than some European kingdoms contained total inhabitants. The Khan himself, while Mongolian by ancestry, ruled according to Chinese principles of imperial authority that had been refined over centuries to achieve levels of efficiency and control that European monarchs could barely imagine. The complexity of court protocols alone suggested challenges that would test diplomatic skills Marco had never needed to develop. Approaches to the imperial presence required navigation of hierarchical systems where a single breach of etiquette could result in exile or death. Gift-giving followed elaborate rules that took years to master completely. Even the languages employed at court, classical Chinese for formal documents, Mongolian for military matters, Persian for international correspondence, demanded linguistic capabilities that few Europeans possessed. Yet the potential rewards for successful integration into the Khan's service seemed to justify the risks involved. European visitors who had managed to establish themselves at the imperial court reportedly achieved positions of influence and wealth that exceeded anything available in their homelands. The Khan's administration, governing territories too vast for any single ethnic group to manage effectively, actively sought foreign talents who could contribute specialized knowledge or provide perspectives unavailable from Chinese advisors. Military engineers, commercial specialists, religious scholars, and diplomatic experts could all find opportunities at Khanbalik that would be impossible to duplicate elsewhere. The month at Hami also provided Marco with his first sustained exposure to Buddhist philosophy through conversations with monks who maintained temples at the oasis. These encounters challenged his European understanding of the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. Unlike Christianity, which existed in constant tension with secular power, Buddhism seemed to coexist peacefully with whatever political system happened to govern. Buddhist monks served imperial administrations without apparent conflict between religious obligations and governmental duties. Their monasteries functioned as centers of learning that preserved knowledge from multiple civilizations while remaining politically neutral in disputes between kingdoms or empires. The Buddhist approach to questions of ultimate truth particularly intrigued Marco. Where Christian theology emphasized revealed doctrine that required faith-based acceptance, Buddhist philosophy seemed to encourage individual investigation of spiritual principles through meditation and direct experience. The monks he spoke with displayed impressive learning in subjects ranging from astronomy to medicine, but they seemed less concerned with establishing orthodoxy than with practical applications of wisdom. Their libraries contained texts from India, China, Central Asia, and regions whose names Marco had never heard, all treated as potentially valuable sources of insight rather than competing claims to exclusive truth. This intellectual openness extended to their approach to other religious traditions. The Buddhist monks at Hami spoke respectfully of Christian communities they had encountered, acknowledging Jesus as a great spiritual teacher, while declining to accept claims about his unique divinity. They described Islamic scholars as fellow seekers after truth whose methods differed, but whose goals seemed compatible with Buddhist aims. Even more surprising, they mentioned Jewish communities in distant Chinese cities where European Jews would have been unimaginable, all apparently coexisting within the Khan's empire without the religious conflicts that plagued European society. The medical knowledge possessed by these Buddhist monks exceeded anything Marco had encountered in European monasteries. They diagnosed illnesses through examination techniques that seemed almost magical in their precision, identifying internal problems through careful observation of pulse, tongue, and complexion. Their treatments combined herbal medicines prepared according to complex formulas with physical manipulations designed to restore what they called the body's natural balance. Most remarkably, they achieved surgical results using procedures and instruments unknown to European physicians, apparently without the massive mortality rates that made European surgery a desperate last resort. Their understanding of astronomy and mathematics similarly surpassed European achievements. The monks maintained accurate calendars that coordinated lunar and solar cycles with precision that European chronologists could not match. They calculated eclipses years in advance and used mathematical principles that enabled architectural projects of unprecedented scale and complexity. Their knowledge of geography extended to regions that European maps represented as blank spaces filled with mythological creatures and speculative geography. As the time came to depart Hami and face the final stages of the journey to Khanbalik, Marco found himself experiencing profound anticipations mixed with equally profound anxieties. The young man who prepared to leave the oasis bore little resemblance to the Venetian merchant's son who had entered the Gobi weeks earlier. The desert crossing had completed a transformation that had been building throughout their journey. He was no longer thinking like a European visiting Asian markets, but beginning to understand the world according to Asian principles and perspectives. The final crossing to Khanbalik would take them through territories where Mongol authority was absolute and unchallenged. These were not frontier regions where multiple powers competed for influence, but core territories of an empire where the Khan's word was law and his administration extended to the smallest details of daily life. The very completeness of Mongol control created both opportunities and dangers that Marco was only beginning to comprehend. Success in such an environment would require not merely survival skills, but cultural adaptabilities that no European education could have provided. The caravan that departed Hami included merchants and officials whose destinations lay deep within Chinese territory. Their presence provided Marco with opportunities to observe the protocols and procedures that governed movement within the Khan's empire. Travel documents had to be presented at regular intervals to officials who examined them with bureaucratic thoroughness that exceeded anything in Europe. The roads themselves, while primitive by modern standards, were maintained according to imperial standards that ensured regular communication between the capital and even the most distant provinces. The postal relay system that connected Khanbalik with the empire's frontiers represented organizational capabilities that dwarfed European achievements. Stations spaced at intervals of exactly 1 day's hard riding provided fresh horses for imperial messengers who could cover distances in days that would require weeks for ordinary travelers. The same system that enabled rapid military communication also facilitated commercial intelligence that gave Chinese merchants significant advantages over competitors who lacked access to such information networks. As they approached the borders of China proper, the landscape began to change in ways that signaled their entry into a realm shaped by human activity on scales that Europe had never imagined. Irrigation systems channeled water across vast distances to support agricultural productivity that seemed impossible given the apparent limitations of soil and climate. Terraced hillsides converted unusable slopes into farmland that supported population densities that would have caused famine conditions in Europe. Villages appeared at regular intervals along roads that showed clear evidence of systematic planning and maintenance. The people they encountered displayed living standards that challenged European assumptions about the relationship between civilization and material prosperity. Even ordinary farmers possessed household goods. Porcelain vessels, silk clothing, metal tools that would have been luxury items in European peasant communities. Their houses, while built according to architectural principles unfamiliar to European eyes, showed construction techniques and decorative refinements that suggested widespread access to skilled craftsmen and quality materials. More striking still was the evidence of literacy among people whose European counterparts would have been entirely unable to read or write. Chinese characters appeared everywhere, on shop signs, official notices, even personal correspondence visible in market areas. The very complexity of Chinese writing suggested educational systems that could produce mass literacy in a script that required knowledge of thousands of individual characters. Such capabilities implied governmental and social resources devoted to education on scales that European kingdoms could never have contemplated. The cities they passed through on the final approach to Khanbalik demonstrated urban planning and administration that exceeded anything in European experience. Streets were laid out according to systematic grids that facilitated both commerce and governmental control. Water supplies were managed through engineering projects that delivered clean water to all districts, while removing waste through sewage systems that prevented the epidemics that regularly devastated European cities. Markets were organized according to principles that balance free commerce with governmental oversight, ensuring fair practices without stifling entrepreneurial initiative. The governmental presence visible in these Chinese cities revealed administrative capabilities that dwarfed European achievements. Officials dressed in distinctive robes, indicating their precise rank, and responsibilities moved through the streets conducting business according to bureaucratic procedures that seemed both efficient and comprehensive. Record-keeping appeared to be maintained at levels of detail that would have been impossible without large numbers of literate clerks and standardized administrative procedures. The very orderliness of urban life suggested governmental competence that European cities, with their frequent conflicts between secular and religious authorities, rarely achieved. As news of their approach preceded them to Cannes, Marco began to understand that their arrival would be treated as a significant diplomatic event. Europeans were sufficiently rare at the imperial court that their presence would attract attention from officials whose responsibilities included monitoring foreign influences and opportunities. The letters they carried from European authorities, limited though these were due to the papal vacancy, would be examined by scholars capable of evaluating both their immediate diplomatic significance and their longer-term implications for the empire's relationships with distant kingdoms. The gifts they had selected so carefully in Venice, designed to demonstrate European craftsmanship and religious devotion, would be judged according to aesthetic and technical standards that had been shaped by access to the finest products of Asian civilization. Items that would have been treasured in European courts might seem crude or barbarous when compared to Chinese imperial artifacts. The challenge would be to present European achievements in ways that emphasize their exotic origins and unique characteristics rather than competing directly with Asian technical superiority. Most crucially, their own conduct during the crucial first encounters would determine whether they would be received as honored guests, useful servants, or exotic curiosities. The diplomatic skills required for successful navigation of imperial court protocols had been developed over centuries to manage relationships between sophisticated civilizations. Europeans who attempted to apply familiar customs and expectations to Chinese court situations invariably found themselves committing errors that could have serious consequences for their future prospects. The final stages of their approach to Khan Balik took place along roads that showed clear evidence of imperial grandeur. Stone bridges crossed rivers with engineering sophistication that surpassed Roman achievements. Way stations provided accommodations that reflected standardized requirements for official travel. Even the milestones that marked distances were carved according to specifications that demonstrated governmental attention to details that European administrators would have considered insignificant. The traffic they encountered on these imperial highways revealed the scope and complexity of Chinese civilization. Officials traveling on governmental business carried documents that authorized their movements and specified their destinations with precision that ensured efficient coordination of administrative activities. Merchants transported goods whose variety and quality demonstrated the productive capabilities of an economy that integrated resources from across the known world. Military units moved according to deployment schedules that maintained imperial security without disrupting civilian activities. As they crested the final ridge before Khan Balik came into view, Marco prepared himself for the culminating encounter of their incredible journey. The city that spread below them represented the center of the largest empire in human history, the residence of a ruler whose authority exceeded that of any European monarch, and the capital of a civilization whose achievements in multiple areas surpassed anything available in Christendom. His success or failure in the crucial days ahead would determine not merely his own future, but the possibilities for European engagement with Asian civilization. The young man who gazed upon Khan Balik for the first time bore no resemblance to the Venetian merchant's son, who had departed the familiar canals of his homeland years earlier. The journey had transformed him into something unprecedented. A European who understood Asian languages, customs, and commercial practices well enough to serve as a bridge between civilizations that had previously existed in mutual ignorance. Whether that bridge would prove strong enough to support the weight of the encounters that lay ahead remained to be determined, but the foundations had been laid through trials that had tested every aspect of his character and capabilities. The great gates of Khan Balik rose before them like thresholds to another world entirely, which, in every sense that mattered, they were. The city that stretched before them defied every expectation that 3 years of travel through the greatest civilizations of Asia had prepared them to form. Khan Balik was not merely large. European cities could be large. It was not merely populous. They had seen crowded markets from Acre to Kashgar. What distinguished the capital of the Mongol Empire was the audacious completeness of its design, as if some divine architect had dreamed of the perfect city, and then commanded it into existence through pure force of imperial will. The outer walls alone proclaimed ambitions that dwarfed European imagination. Built of stone and brick to heights that seemed to challenge heaven itself, they enclosed an area that could have contained Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople, with room for smaller cities besides. Towers punctuated the walls at intervals so regular they seemed to have been placed by mathematical calculation rather than military necessity. Guards moved along the ramparts in formations that suggested discipline and organization extending to the smallest details of imperial security. But it was the internal organization visible even from their distant vantage point that truly revealed the scope of Chinese administrative achievement. The city was divided into distinct quarters by walls almost as impressive as the outer fortifications, each section apparently devoted to specific functions: governmental, commercial, residential, military. Streets ran in perfect geometric patterns that could only have been achieved through central planning of unprecedented sophistication. Even the spacing between buildings seemed to follow standardized principles that balanced private needs with public order. The palace complex at the city's heart rose above the surrounding structures like a mountain of gold and jade. Its roofs, tiled in yellow that caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in sheets of radiance, seemed to float above walls whose red lacquer was visible even at their distance. Gardens within the palace grounds created geometric patterns of green that suggested landscape design elevated to the level of art. The very scale of the imperial residence indicated governmental resources and aesthetic ambitions that exceeded anything in European royal architecture. As their caravan descended toward the city gates, Marco found himself struggling to process the human implications of what he was witnessing. Khan Balik was not merely a large city, but a manufactured environment designed to accommodate populations that would have strained the agricultural resources of entire European kingdoms. The logistics required to feed, house, and govern such concentrations of humanity demanded organizational capabilities that challenged his understanding of what human administration could accomplish. The approaches to the main gate revealed urban planning principles that spoke of governmental sophistication, extending to concerns that European cities rarely addressed systematically. Drainage ditches channeled water and waste away from residential areas according to engineering principles that prevented the epidemics that regularly devastated European urban centers. Road surfaces were maintained in conditions that facilitated both military movement and commercial transport. Even the placement of trees along major thoroughfares seemed designed to provide shade and visual appeal, while maintaining clear sight lines for security purposes. The traffic converging on the city gates from multiple directions demonstrated the scope of the empire's commercial and administrative networks. Caravans from Central Asia carried goods whose origins stretched back along the Silk Road to Mediterranean markets. Convoys from southern China transported products of tropical regions that Marco could only guess at. Military units moved with precision that indicated systematic rotation of forces between the capital and frontier posts. Officials traveled in vehicles whose elaborate decoration proclaimed their importance within imperial hierarchies whose complexity he was only beginning to appreciate. The guards who examined their travel documents at the outer gate possessed equipment and bearing that surpassed European military standards. Their weapons, swords whose steel showed folding techniques unknown to European smiths, bows whose composite construction enabled accuracy at ranges impossible with European archery, represented technological advantages that extended beyond mere craftsmanship to underlying metallurgical and engineering knowledge. Their armor, while different in design from European mail and plate, showed construction principles that balanced protection with mobility in ways that suggested centuries of military innovation. More impressive still was the bureaucratic efficiency with which they processed the constant stream of arrivals. Each traveler's documentation was examined according to procedures that enabled rapid identification of authorization level and destination within the city. Records were maintained in multiple copies that presumably allowed cross-checking against other governmental databases. The entire system functioned with mechanical precision that ensured security without creating the bottlenecks that would have paralyzed European gatekeeping attempts. The streets beyond the gates revealed urban life organized according to principles that balanced individual commerce with collective order in ways European cities had never achieved. Shops lined major thoroughfares according to rational arrangements that grouped similar trades together while ensuring that essential services remained accessible from all residential areas. Traffic flowed along designated routes that prevented the chaos that characterized European urban transportation. Even the noise level seemed controlled, busy but not cacophonous, energetic but not overwhelming. The diversity of the population visible in these streets demonstrated the cosmopolitan character of imperial administration. Chinese officials in distinctive robes moved alongside Mongol warriors whose dress and bearing proclaimed their nomadic origins. Persian merchants conducted business in market areas where their languages and customs seemed as natural as those of Chinese traders. European visitors, while clearly exotic, were not unique. Other pale faces occasionally appeared in the crowd, suggesting that contact with distant Western lands occurred with sufficient frequency to establish precedents for their reception. The architecture surrounding them as they moved deeper into the city revealed aesthetic principles that challenged European assumptions about the relationship between beauty and function. Chinese buildings achieved visual harmony through proportional relationships that seemed to spring from mathematical principles rather than mere decorative intent. The curved roofs that characterized Chinese construction served practical purposes, shedding rain and snow effectively while creating interior spaces with superior acoustics, but their graceful lines transformed utilitarian structures into objects of contemplation and delight. The craft specialization visible in even casual observation of street activities demonstrated economic development that exceeded European achievements in multiple areas. Metalworkers produced items whose technical quality surpassed anything in European workshops. Textile workers created fabrics whose fineness and coloration techniques were unknown in Western manufactories. Woodworkers employed joinery methods that enabled construction without the heavy use of metal fasteners that European techniques required. Even food preparation showed refinements that suggested culinary traditions developed through centuries of systematic experimentation and innovation. The cleanliness of the urban environment particularly impressed Marco after his experience with European cities where waste disposal remained primitive and disease-breeding conditions were accepted as inevitable. Chinese cities maintained sanitation standards that prevented the accumulation of refuse and human waste that made European urban life dangerous to health. Water supplies were protected through systematic measures that ensured purity while preventing contamination from reaching residential areas. Even the air seemed cleaner. Smokeless fuel and efficient stove designs eliminated much of the pollution that made European cities unpleasant for anyone with alternatives. As they approached the governmental quarter where their formal reception would take place, the evidence of administrative sophistication became overwhelming. Buildings devoted to specific governmental functions were organized according to rational principles that facilitated both efficient operation and hierarchical control. Record-keeping facilities showed scales of documentation that indicated systematic attention to administrative detail extending to aspects of governance that European kingdoms managed only sporadically. The sheer number of officials visible suggested bureaucratic capabilities that could manage the complex requirements of governing populations and territories on previously unimaginable scales. The protocols governing their approach to the imperial presence revealed diplomatic sophistication that had been refined through centuries of managing relationships with foreign powers. Their Mongol guides, transformed from desert travelers into court functionaries, demonstrated familiarity with procedures whose complexity required extensive training to master. The sequence of preliminary meetings, document examinations, and gift presentations followed established patterns designed to evaluate foreign visitors while providing opportunities for them to demonstrate their potential value to imperial service. The waiting periods imposed between stages of the reception process served multiple purposes beyond mere protocol. They allowed imperial officials to conduct background investigations that verified the visitors' claims about their origins and purposes. They provided opportunities for the foreigners to observe court customs and adjust their behavior accordingly. Most importantly, they created psychological pressure that tested the visitors' patience, adaptability, and commitment to the difficult process of integration into Chinese governmental service. The quarters assigned to them during these preliminary stages demonstrated the material prosperity that imperial service could provide while establishing clear hierarchical distinctions that reinforced governmental order. Their accommodations, while comfortable by any reasonable standard, were clearly designated for foreign visitors of uncertain status rather than established courtiers. The furnishings, silk hangings, porcelain vessels, lacquered furniture represented luxury items that would have been priceless in Europe but seemed routine appointments within the imperial capital. The meals provided offered Marco his first systematic introduction to Chinese culinary traditions, whose sophistication exceeded anything in European dining. Rice, prepared according to techniques that enhanced both nutritional value and palatability, served as the foundation for meals that incorporated vegetables, meats, and seasonings in combinations that created flavor profiles entirely unknown to European palates. The chopsticks required for proper consumption demanded manual dexterity that had to be developed through practice, but they enabled more precise manipulation of food than the crude utensils employed in European dining. The cultural instruction provided during their waiting period revealed the depth of preparation that successful service at the imperial court required. Chinese characters had to be learned sufficiently to read basic documents and understand written communications. Court etiquette demanded mastery of gesture, posture, and speech patterns that could only be acquired through careful observation and persistent practice. Even clothing had to conform to regulations that specified appropriate materials, colors, and styles for different occasions and hierarchical positions. The linguistic challenges proved particularly demanding. While Persian served as a diplomatic language familiar to many court officials, effective service required facility in Chinese dialects, whose tonal nature made accurate pronunciation crucial for clear communication. Mistakes in tone could transform intended meanings into insults or absurdities that would destroy carefully cultivated relationships. The written language presented even greater difficulties. Thousands of individual characters had to be memorized before basic literacy could be achieved. And scholarly competence required knowledge of classical forms whose complexity exceeded the demands of contemporary usage. The religious accommodations offered to Christian visitors demonstrated the tolerant pragmatism that characterized Mongol administration of their multicultural empire. Churches served Nestorian Christian communities whose traditions had evolved in isolation from European ecclesiastical authority for centuries. Their services included elements that seemed familiar alongside practices that reflected adaptation to Asian cultural contexts. The theological discussions possible with these Eastern Christians revealed perspectives on Christian doctrine that had developed without papal influence or European scholastic methodology. More challenging to Marco's European assumptions were the Buddhist and Taoist temples that played central roles in Chinese spiritual life. The philosophical sophistication of these traditions exceeded anything he had encountered outside of Christian monasticism, yet their approaches to ultimate questions differed fundamentally from European theological methods. Buddhist meditation techniques offered paths to spiritual insight that bypassed doctrinal instruction, while Taoist practices emphasized harmony with natural principles rather than submission to revealed authority. The Confucian ethical system that provided philosophical foundation for Chinese governmental service presented concepts of social obligation and personal cultivation that paralleled Christian moral teaching in some areas while diverging significantly in others. The emphasis on education, self-improvement, and service to collective welfare resonated with European ideals of virtuous conduct. but the absence of transcendent divine authority and the focus on human perfectibility through rational effort challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between earthly and spiritual realms. The economic opportunities visible throughout Canbalik demonstrated the commercial possibilities that had motivated the Polo family's extraordinary journey. Markets displayed goods from regions whose names appeared on no European map, their qualities and values determined by supply networks that extended across the known world. Luxury items that commanded premium prices in European markets were available in quantities and varieties that suggested regular trade relationships with their sources. Most intriguingly, there seemed to be genuine demand for European products that had never appeared in Chinese markets. Religious artifacts, metalwork techniques, and textile designs that offered novelty value to consumers accustomed to Asian goods. The monetary system that facilitated Chinese commerce demonstrated financial sophistication that exceeded European capabilities in multiple areas. Paper currency, backed by imperial authority and accepted throughout the empire, eliminated the transportation difficulties that limited European long-distance trade to high-value goods that could bear the costs of moving precious metals across dangerous territories. Banking instruments enabled credit relationships that supported commercial ventures requiring capital investment over extended periods. Even the accounting methods employed by Chinese merchants showed mathematical techniques that improved accuracy while reducing the time required for complex calculations. The industrial capabilities visible in Chinese workshops suggested technological advantages that could revolutionize European production methods if successfully transferred. Silk manufacturing employed techniques whose secrets were guarded with care that reflected their economic value, but observation revealed processes that achieved results impossible with European methods. Porcelain production created ceramics whose strength and beauty exceeded anything available in Western pottery. Metalworking techniques produced steel, whose quality surpassed European weapons and tools through methods that incorporated knowledge of metallurgy unknown to European craftsmen. The printing technology used for producing books and official documents represented perhaps the most revolutionary capability from a European perspective. The ability to reproduce written materials in large quantities with perfect accuracy offered possibilities for education, administration, and religious instruction that could transform European civilization if successfully adapted. The implications for spreading literacy, preserving knowledge, and coordinating governmental activities across large territories were so significant that Marcos struggled to comprehend their full potential. As weeks of preparation and cultural orientation passed, the complexity of serving effectively at the imperial court became increasingly apparent. Success required not merely survival skills or commercial acumen, but cultural adaptability of unprecedented scope. European visitors who attempted to maintain their familiar customs and perspectives invariably found themselves marginalized within court hierarchies that rewarded conformity to Chinese administrative principles. Those who achieved influence and wealth did so by transforming themselves sufficiently to function as effective intermediaries between imperial authority and the diverse populations that comprised the Mongol Empire. The personal transformation that such service demanded went beyond learning new languages or adopting unfamiliar customs. It required fundamental reorientation of identity, values, and loyalties that European experience provided no preparation for. Successful courtiers thought of themselves primarily as servants of imperial authority rather than representatives of their nations of origin. They measured success according to Chinese criteria rather than European standards. Most profoundly, they accepted philosophical assumptions about human nature, social organization, and cosmic order that differed fundamentally from European Christian teaching. The psychological pressures of such transformation tested personalities in ways that revealed character traits invisible under familiar circumstances. Some Europeans thrived in environments that rewarded intelligence, adaptability, and dedication to service regardless of ethnic origins. Others found themselves psychologically unable to abandon the cultural foundations that had shaped their identities since childhood. The most successful seemed to be those who possessed sufficient intellectual flexibility to appreciate Chinese achievements, while retaining enough European perspective to offer genuinely valuable foreign insights. The moment of truth that would determine Marco's fate approached with each passing day of preparation. His performance during the crucial First Imperial audience would establish his value within court hierarchies and determine the scope of opportunities available to him throughout his years of service. The skills he had developed during years of travel, the cultural knowledge he had acquired through careful observation, and the personal qualities that had enabled his survival through extraordinary hardships would all be tested in a single encounter whose consequences would shape the remainder of his life. The summons, when it finally came, arrived through channels that demonstrated the elaborate communications networks connecting all levels of imperial administration. Written in Chinese characters whose calligraphy reflected the importance of the message, it specified the time, location, and protocols governing his presentation to Kublai Khan. The document itself, prepared on paper whose quality exceeded anything available in Europe, and sealed with wax that bore the imperial insignia, served as tangible evidence of the governmental sophistication that managed every aspect of life within the empire. The ceremonial robes provided for the audience represented another demonstration of Chinese aesthetic achievement and economic capabilities. The silk showed weaving techniques that created patterns of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The colors, achieved through dyeing processes unknown to European textile workers, remained vivid and stable in ways that European cloth could not match. Even the tailoring reflected mathematical principles that ensured proper fit while accommodating the movements required by court etiquette. As Marco prepared for the encounter that would determine his future, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. The Venetian merchant's son who had departed his native city 3 years earlier no longer existed except in memory. The young man who now prepared to meet the most powerful ruler on earth had been transformed by experiences that challenged every assumption his European upbringing had provided. Whether that transformation would prove sufficient for success in the Chinese imperial court remained to be determined, but the foundations had been established through trials that had tested every aspect of his character and capabilities. The walk through the palace corridors toward the imperial presence chamber took him past artistic achievements that summarized the cultural sophistication of Chinese civilization. Paintings whose technical mastery exceeded European religious art depicted landscapes that seemed to capture the essential spirit of natural beauty, rather than merely reproducing visual appearances. Sculptures achieved effects through subtle manipulation of form and space that created emotional responses without obvious dramatic content. Even the architecture itself, with its careful proportions and harmonious relationships between different structural elements, demonstrated aesthetic principles that transformed functional spaces into environments that elevated the human spirit. The courtiers they passed during this procession represented the international character of imperial administration, while demonstrating the complete cultural assimilation that successful service required. Officials whose physical appearance suggested Central Asian, Persian, or even European origins moved with confidence and authority that indicated their full integration into Chinese governmental hierarchies. Their dress, their bearing, their methods of interaction all conformed to Chinese standards, while their presence proved that ethnic identity need not prevent advancement within imperial service for those willing to undergo the necessary cultural transformation. The final approach to the throne room revealed the ultimate expression of imperial authority translated into physical form. Guards whose equipment and training represented the highest achievements of military organization stood at positions that commanded every approach while remaining nearly invisible until close examination revealed their presence. The doors themselves, constructed from wood whose quality required selection from forests whose locations were state secrets, showed craftsmanship that transformed utilitarian barriers into artistic statements about the power and refinement of imperial authority. The moment of entry into Kublai Khan's presence would mark the culmination of Marco Polo's transformation, from European merchant son to participant in Asian imperial service. Everything that had come before, the years of travel, the cultural adaptation, the linguistic study, the psychological adjustment to alien ways of understanding reality, had been preparation for this encounter. Everything that would follow would flow from the relationships established and the impressions created during the crucial minutes of their first meeting. As the great doors opened and Marco Polo stepped forward to meet his destiny, he carried with him not merely the hopes of his family for commercial success, but the possibility of creating unprecedented bridges between civilizations that had existed in mutual ignorance for too long. The throne room that Marco entered seemed to exist outside the normal dimensions of earthly architecture. The ceiling soared to heights that disappeared into shadows punctuated by points of light from lanterns whose placement created patterns that seemed to mirror the constellations visible through openings cut with mathematical precision. The floor, polished stone inlaid with precious metals in geometric designs of staggering complexity, reflected the ambient illumination in ways that made the very ground seem to glow with inner light. Pillars of jade and gold supported the impossible span of roof above, their surfaces carved with dragons and phoenixes whose writhing forms seemed to move in the flickering illumination. But it was the figure seated upon the throne at the chamber's far end that commanded attention with magnetic intensity. Kublai Khan possessed physical presence that transcended mere size or ceremonial grandeur. Though Mongolian by blood, his bearing reflected the sophisticated refinement of Chinese imperial culture, while retaining the predatory alertness of his nomadic ancestors. His robes, woven from silk so fine it seemed spun from moonlight itself, moved with his breathing in ways that suggested the constant awareness of a hunter even in moments of apparent repose. His eyes, when they fixed upon the approaching Europeans, seemed to pierce through surface appearances to evaluate the essential character of the men before him. The protocols governing approach to the imperial presence required movements choreographed with ceremonial precision. Each step forward followed patterns established over centuries to demonstrate proper submission while maintaining personal dignity. The prescribed genuflections at specific points acknowledged imperial authority without reducing visitors to groveling supplicants. Even the timing of eye contact was regulated, too direct and it constituted unacceptable presumption, too deferential, and it suggested deception or cowardice. Marco found himself drawing upon every observation made during weeks of preparation, his European instincts constantly corrected by hard-won knowledge of Chinese court expectations. When they reached the designated position before the throne, Kublai Khan's voice filled the vast chamber with resonant authority that seemed to spring from sources deeper than mere vocal cords. He spoke in Mongolian, his words translated by court interpreters whose linguistic skills enabled precise communication across cultural barriers that might otherwise have proven insurmountable. The questions he posed revealed intellectual curiosity that extended far beyond conventional diplomatic inquiries. He wanted to understand not merely who these Europeans were, but what their presence might mean for his empire's future relationships with distant lands. Marco found himself serving as spokesman for an entire continent, attempting to explain European geography, politics, and culture to a mind that operated according to fundamentally different assumptions about human nature and social organization. The Khan's questions probed European military capabilities, commercial practices, religious beliefs, and governmental structures with systematic thoroughness that revealed strategic thinking of unprecedented sophistication. Each answer prompted follow-up inquiries that demonstrated the emperor's ability to identify implications and connections that less capable minds would have overlooked entirely. The gifts they presented, carefully selected items intended to demonstrate European craftsmanship while avoiding direct competition with Chinese technical superiority, were examined with attention that seemed to extract every possible detail about their origins, construction, and cultural significance. The Khan's comments revealed appreciation for foreign aesthetic principles while maintaining clear awareness of how European achievements compared to Asian standards. His responses balanced diplomatic courtesy with honest evaluation that neither inflated European accomplishments nor dismissed them as insignificant curiosities. But it was the Khan's questions about Christianity that revealed the true depth of his intellectual engagement with the implications of European contact. His inquiries demonstrated sophisticated understanding of religious concepts acquired through extensive consultation with Nestorian Christians, Buddhist philosophers, and Islamic scholars within his court. He seemed less interested in theological doctrine than in Christianity's practical effects, how it influenced European political organization, commercial ethics, and cultural development. His question suggested genuine curiosity about whether Christian civilization possessed qualities that might benefit his empire if properly understood and adapted. The audience extended far beyond the brief ceremonial encounter that Marco had anticipated. Hours passed as the Khan probed every aspect of European civilization that might prove relevant to imperial interests. His energy seemed inexhaustible, his attention to detail relentless, his capacity for absorbing new information apparently unlimited. The courtiers who surrounded the throne maintained positions that enabled them to observe and record every detail of the exchange, their presence a reminder that this encounter would be preserved in imperial archives and analyzed by scholars whose conclusions would influence future policy toward European contact. The most crucial moment came when Kublai Khan shifted from questioning to evaluation, his penetrating gaze seeming to weigh not merely Marco's knowledge, but his character, his potential usefulness, and his capacity for the cultural transformation that imperial service would require. The silence stretched until it seemed to press against the throne room's walls with physical weight. When the Khan finally spoke, his words carried the authority of decisions that would reshape 3 lives entirely. The positions offered to the Polo family exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Niccolò and Maffeo would serve as commercial advisors, their knowledge of Western trade routes and European market conditions providing intelligence valuable for imperial economic planning. But it was the opportunity extended to Marco that represented true recognition of exceptional potential. The Khan proposed to employ him as a traveling inspector, using his foreign perspective and linguistic skills to observe conditions throughout the empire and report directly to imperial authority. Such appointments were reserved for individuals whose intelligence, integrity, and cultural adaptability had been proven through the most demanding tests. The acceptance of imperial service carried implications that transformed their legal and social status within Chinese society. They were no longer foreign visitors, subject to the restrictions and uncertainties that govern temporary residence, but imperial officials whose authority derived directly from the Khan's mandate. Their safety was guaranteed by the same power that protected Chinese administrators. Their access to information, transportation, and resources was limited only by the scope of their assignments. Most significantly, their opportunities for advancement depended entirely on their performance rather than their ethnic origins or family connections. The years that followed Marco's acceptance into imperial service provided him with experiences that no European before him had imagined possible. His assignments as traveling inspector carried him to regions whose names existed only in the vaguest European legends, through landscapes that challenged every assumption about terrestrial geography, among peoples whose customs revealed the extraordinary diversity of human cultural achievement. Each journey expanded his understanding of the world's true dimensions, while demonstrating the remarkable effectiveness of Chinese administrative methods in governing populations and territories of unprecedented scale. His first major assignment took him south into the tropical regions where Chinese authority extended to kingdoms that acknowledged imperial overlordship while maintaining their own cultural traditions. The journey itself revealed transportation networks that connected even the most remote provinces with the imperial capital through systems of roads, canals, and way stations that enabled rapid communication across distances that European couriers would require months to traverse. The boats that carried him along rivers whose size dwarfed European waterways employed navigation techniques that enabled precise positioning even in waters that seemed to lack recognizable landmarks. The cities he encountered during these southern expeditions demonstrated urban planning principles adapted to climatic conditions that European architects had never confronted. Buildings designed to channel cooling breezes through interior spaces, while excluding the oppressive heat that made outdoor activity dangerous during midday hours. Drainage systems that manage monsoon rains whose intensity would have flooded European cities built according to temperate climate assumptions, markets that operated according to schedules coordinated with weather patterns, their activities shifting to take advantage of cooler temperatures while avoiding the brutal sun of tropical afternoons. The peoples he met revealed human adaptability that exceeded European understanding of civilization's possibilities. Coastal communities whose entire economies depended on maritime skills that enabled navigation across oceans whose distances European mariners would have considered impassable. Agricultural societies that achieved productivity levels supporting population densities impossible in European farming regions through cultivation techniques adapted to tropical growing conditions. Trading networks that connected regions separated by thousands of miles through commercial relationships maintained across generations without written contracts or legal enforcement mechanisms. The religious diversity he witnessed challenged his European assumption that human spiritual needs required similar institutional responses. Buddhist temples whose architectural grandeur rivaled European cathedrals served communities whose devotional practices emphasized individual enlightenment rather than collective worship. Hindu shrines whose elaborate iconography depicted divine relationships that bore no resemblance to Christian theology yet clearly provided their devotees with profound spiritual satisfaction. Animist traditions that found sacred presence in natural phenomena, their rituals designed to maintain harmony between human communities and the spiritual forces inhabiting the physical landscape. The languages he encountered required constant expansion of his linguistic capabilities. Chinese dialects that differed so significantly from the court language he had learned that effective communication required mastery of entirely new vocabulary and grammatical structures. Local tongues that incorporated tonal variations whose subtle differences could transform intended meanings into unintended insults. Written systems that employed different characters or scripts, each requiring separate study to achieve even basic literacy. The mental flexibility demanded by such constant linguistic adaptation transformed his thinking in ways that enabled him to perceive cultural differences with unprecedented clarity and precision. His reports to the imperial court gained recognition for their analytical depth and practical utility. The Khan valued not merely factual information about distant provinces, but insights into cultural dynamics that might affect imperial policy decisions. Marco's European perspective enabled him to identify patterns and relationships that Chinese officials, despite their superior cultural knowledge, might overlook due to their immersion in familiar assumptions. His recommendations regarding administrative adjustments, commercial opportunities, and potential problems frequently influenced imperial decisions affecting millions of people across vast territories. The trust placed in him by imperial authority expanded with each successful assignment. Missions that initially required careful supervision gradually gave way to independent responsibilities that tested his judgment and cultural sensitivity. He found himself mediating disputes between different ethnic communities, evaluating the performance of local officials whose cultural backgrounds differed dramatically from Chinese administrative traditions, and identifying opportunities for economic development that could benefit both local populations and imperial revenues. The personal transformation that such service demanded exceeded anything his European upbringing could have prepared him for. The young man who had entered Kublai Khan's service retained his Christian faith and his essential loyalty to his family, but his understanding of human nature, social organization, and cultural possibility had been revolutionized through experiences that few human beings in any era had been privileged to undergo. He thought in multiple languages, evaluated situations according to criteria drawn from different cultural traditions, and solved problems using methodological approaches that combined European analytical habits with Asian practical wisdom. His mastery of Chinese culture eventually reached levels that enabled him to participate in scholarly discussions with educated officials whose knowledge encompassed subjects unknown to European learning. Historical studies that trace Chinese civilization back through centuries of documented development. Philosophical investigations that explored questions of ethics, governance, and human nature through systematic reasoning that paralleled but differed significantly from European scholastic methods. Scientific inquiries that incorporated mathematical principles and observational techniques that exceeded European achievements in multiple areas. The commercial intelligence he gathered during his travels revealed economic opportunities that could transform European prosperity if successfully exploited. Trade routes that connected Asian markets with sources of goods that commanded premium prices in European cities. Production techniques that could revolutionize European manufacturing if their secrets could be acquired and adapted. Financial instruments that enabled commercial ventures requiring capital investments over extended periods and across dangerous territories. The challenge would be communicating such possibilities to European merchants whose imaginations were constrained by their limited understanding of Asian capabilities. The 17 years of imperial service that followed provided Marco with opportunities for cultural immersion that transformed him more completely than any European had ever been changed through contact with Asian civilization. He served in positions that required complete integration into Chinese administrative hierarchies, while maintaining sufficient foreign perspective to offer genuinely valuable insights. He traveled to regions whose geographic and cultural diversity challenged every assumption about terrestrial possibilities. He participated in governmental decisions that affected populations larger than the total inhabitants of Europe. Yet even as his service proved increasingly valuable to imperial authority, the psychological costs of such complete cultural transformation gradually accumulated. The isolation that came from existing between worlds, too Chinese for European understanding, too European for complete Chinese acceptance, created emotional burdens that no training could have prepared him to carry. The knowledge that his extraordinary experiences could never be fully shared with anyone who had not undergone similar transformation left him intellectually alone, even when surrounded by colleagues and friends. The letters from Venice that occasionally reached him through the elaborate postal networks connecting the empire with its distant frontiers brought news of a world that seemed increasingly remote and irrelevant to his daily reality. Deaths of relatives he remembered dimly, political changes in European kingdoms whose significance seemed trivial compared to imperial decision-making, commercial developments in Mediterranean markets that appeared microscopic beside Asian trade networks. The emotional connections that had once bound him to his homeland gradually weakened under the pressure of years spent in environments where European concerns meant nothing and European skills provided no advantages. The relationship with his father and uncle, initially strengthened by their shared experiences during the incredible journey to Khanbalik, gradually became more complex as their paths within imperial service diverged. Niccolo and Maffeo found satisfying roles as commercial advisors whose knowledge remained relevant to their daily responsibilities, but their cultural adaptation was limited to what their positions required. They retained more European identity than Marco, whose complete immersion in Chinese governmental service demanded more fundamental transformation. The conversations that had once bound them together as fellow Europeans in an alien land became more difficult as Marco's frame of reference shifted toward perspectives that his father and uncle could no longer fully share. The turning point came in 1292, when political changes within the Mongol Empire created uncertainty about the future security of foreign officials whose positions depended entirely on imperial favor. Kublai Khan's death marked the end of an era of unprecedented stability and cultural tolerance that had enabled Europeans to serve with confidence in their protection and advancement. The succession struggles that followed introduced new elements of risk into calculations that had previously seemed straightforward. Officials whose loyalty was unquestioned found themselves vulnerable to suspicions based on their ethnic origins rather than their service records. The decision to request permission to return to Europe was motivated less by homesickness than by realistic assessment of changing political conditions. The new Khan, while maintaining formal respect for his predecessor's policies, clearly preferred advisors whose Chinese cultural credentials could not be questioned. Foreign officials found their access to sensitive information restricted and their opportunities for advancement limited in ways that suggested systematic policy changes rather than personal discrimination. The handwriting was on the wall for those with eyes to see it. The opportunity that enabled their departure came through a diplomatic mission that required escorts familiar with maritime travel to distant lands. A Mongol princess was to be transported by sea to Persia for marriage to a ruler whose alliance was crucial for maintaining imperial authority in Western territories. The journey would be dangerous. Ocean travel was inherently risky and the political situation in Persia was unstable, but it offered the Polo family a chance to leave China with honor while serving imperial interests one final time. The preparations for departure revealed how completely Marco's identity had been transformed during his years of imperial service. The possessions he chose to take with him were predominantly Asian in origin and character: books written in Chinese, clothing cut according to Chinese patterns, personal items whose significance would be meaningless to European eyes. The skills he had developed were more relevant to Asian environments than European ones. Even his physical appearance had been changed by years of adaptation to Asian climates and customs, his bearing reflecting cultural habits that marked him as foreign even in his native land. The farewell audiences with imperial officials who had become colleagues and friends over nearly 2 decades were emotionally wrenching in ways that surprised him with their intensity. The relationships formed through shared service had created bonds that transcended ethnic and cultural differences, connections that had replaced the family and social ties that distance and time had gradually severed. Leaving China meant abandoning not merely a career, but an entire identity that had been constructed through years of careful cultural adaptation. The sea journey that carried them away from the Asian mainland provided opportunities for reflection that the demanding pace of imperial service had rarely allowed. The young man who watched the Chinese coastline disappear beyond the western horizon bore little resemblance to the European who had entered Kublai Khan's service decades earlier. His knowledge encompassed subjects that no European had ever studied. His experiences included adventures that no European had ever shared. His perspective on human possibilities had been shaped by exposure to cultural achievements that European imagination had never conceived. The voyage itself, conducted aboard Chinese vessels using navigation techniques unknown to European mariners, demonstrated once again the technological superiority that had characterized every aspect of his Asian experience. The ships employed compass systems that enabled accurate course plotting even when celestial navigation was impossible due to weather conditions. The maritime charts showed detailed knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal patterns that European navigators acquired only through dangerous trial and error. Even the provisions carried for the extended ocean crossing reflected nutritional understanding that prevented the diseases that regularly decimated European sea voyages. The princess they escorted proved to be a cultured woman, whose education exceeded that of most European nobility, her conversation revealing intellectual sophistication that challenged his assumptions about the relationship between gender and learning in Asian societies. Her understanding of political, economic, and cultural issues demonstrated the high standards expected of imperial family members whose marriages served diplomatic purposes. Her library included works of Chinese poetry, philosophy, and history that provided Marco with reading material during the long weeks of ocean travel. The storms they encountered during the passage across the Indian Ocean tested the seamanship of Chinese crews whose skills had been developed through centuries of maritime experience in waters that European sailors had never attempted to navigate. The techniques employed for managing vessels in conditions that would have destroyed European ships revealed engineering principles and practical knowledge that had been refined through generations of dangerous experience. The survival skills demonstrated by crew members whose lives depended on their competence in maritime environments showed training that exceeded European naval preparation in every significant detail. The ports where they stopped for supplies and repairs demonstrated the scope of Chinese commercial influence extending far beyond the territorial boundaries of the empire itself. Harbors that served Chinese merchant fleets were organized according to engineering principles that facilitated efficient cargo handling, while providing security for valuable goods during extended stopovers. The commercial relationships maintained between Chinese traders and local merchants operated according to credit systems that enabled complex transactions without requiring physical transportation of precious metals across dangerous territories. The cultural diversity encountered during their progress across the Indian Ocean revealed again the extraordinary scope of human achievement that Marco's Asian experience had made accessible to him. Islamic kingdoms whose architectural and artistic accomplishments rivaled Chinese achievements while following entirely different aesthetic principles. Hindu principalities whose philosophical traditions explored questions of human nature and cosmic order through methodologies that paralleled but differed significantly from both Chinese and European approaches. Trading communities that included representatives of cultures whose names appeared on no European map, their presence demonstrating commercial networks that connected regions European geography had never attempted to locate. The gradual approach to waters familiar to European navigation marked psychological as well as geographic transitions that prepared Marco for the cultural readjustment that awaited him in Venice. The maritime techniques employed by Arab and Mediterranean sailors seemed primitive compared to Chinese methods, their vessels small and vulnerable beside the ocean-going ships that had carried him across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Even the commercial practices observed in ports that served Mediterranean trade appeared unsophisticated when measured against the standards he had learned during his Asian experience. The princess they escorted reached her destination safely, her marriage accomplished with ceremonial grandeur that demonstrated the diplomatic importance of maintaining Chinese influence in Western territories. The successful completion of their final imperial service enabled the Polo family to depart with honor and generous compensation for years of faithful service. More importantly, it provided them with diplomatic credentials that would ensure safe passage through territories where their protection depended on official recognition of their status as former imperial officials. The overland journey from Persia toward the Mediterranean retraced portions of the route they had followed decades earlier, but the travelers who now made this passage bore little resemblance to the merchant family who had originally ventured into Asian territories. Their knowledge of languages, customs, and commercial practices enabled them to navigate cultural transitions with confidence that had been impossible during their initial Eastern journey. Their understanding of political relationships and regional power structures allowed them to avoid dangers that had threatened their earlier passage through the same territories. Yet the very completeness of their cultural adaptation created new forms of difficulty. Marco found himself constantly translating not merely between languages, but between entire worldviews, his Asian perspective requiring conscious adjustment to communicate effectively with peoples whose assumptions about reality differed fundamentally from Chinese understanding. The intellectual habits developed through years of service in imperial administration seemed inappropriate for interactions governed by European or Middle Eastern cultural expectations. Most challenging of all, the knowledge that had made him valuable within Chinese governmental hierarchies seemed irrelevant to circumstances where different skills and different forms of understanding were required for success. The Mediterranean waters that finally came into view carried emotional significance that surprised him with their intensity. These were the seas of his childhood, the maritime environment that had shaped his earliest understanding of what the world contained and what human possibilities it offered. Yet the young man who now gazed upon familiar horizons could no longer think of these waters as encompassing the extent of earthly possibilities. They were merely one small portion of oceanic systems that connected continents whose existence European geography had never suspected, their commercial and cultural significance dwarfed by Asian achievements that European imagination was incapable of comprehending. The approach to Venice itself provided the culminating test of identity and belonging that would determine whether his return to European society could succeed. The city that appeared across the familiar waters of the Adriatic seemed simultaneously smaller and more precious than memory had preserved it. The architectural achievements that had once seemed to represent the pinnacle of human artistic accomplishment now appeared modest beside Chinese imperial construction. Yet they retained emotional resonance that no Asian building could match. The commercial activity visible in the harbor suggested prosperity and entrepreneurial energy, but the scale of operations seemed microscopic compared to Chinese economic networks that moved goods across continents as routinely as Venetian merchants transported cargo across Mediterranean distances. The reunion with relatives and friends who had aged 24 years during his absence revealed the full extent of the changes that time and experience had wrought. The people who welcomed him home possessed the same names and occupied the same relationships that memory preserved, but their concerns, their perspectives, Their understanding of what life offered seemed to belong to a different species of humanity entirely. Their questions about his experiences revealed how limited European imagination was when confronted with realities that challenged every assumption about geographical, cultural, and technological possibilities. The stories he attempted to share met with responses that ranged from polite skepticism to open disbelief. The cities he described seemed too large to be credible, their populations too numerous to be supported by any conceivable agricultural resources. The governmental systems he had served within appeared too complex and too effective to represent anything but fantasy. The commercial networks he had observed seemed to operate on scales that defied everything Europeans understood about the practical limitations of long-distance trade. Even his descriptions of Chinese technological achievements were dismissed as impossible exaggerations by listeners whose knowledge of engineering and manufacturing capabilities was constrained by European limitations. The wealth he and his family had accumulated through years of imperial service provided tangible evidence that their Asian experience had been profitable, but even this concrete demonstration of success failed to convince skeptical audiences that the stories justifying such profits could be literally true. The precious stones, the exotic textiles, the unusual artifacts they had brought from China were accepted as evidence of successful trading ventures to distant lands. But the explanations of where and how such items had been acquired seemed too extraordinary for rational belief. The cultural isolation that resulted from this inability to communicate his experiences effectively created psychological burdens that no preparation could have anticipated. The knowledge that had been gained through decades of extraordinary experience could not be shared with anyone who lacked similar background. The perspectives that had been developed through immersion in Asian civilization could not be understood by minds that had never encountered alternatives to European assumptions. The very completeness of his transformation, which had enabled unprecedented success within Chinese imperial service, now prevented effective reintegration into the European social environment that should have welcomed him home. The commercial applications of Asian knowledge proved equally frustrating. The trade opportunities he had identified required capital investments and risk tolerance that exceeded the capabilities of most Venetian merchants. The production techniques he had observed could not be replicated without access to materials and skilled craftsmen unavailable in European markets. Most significantly, the organizational methods that had enabled Chinese commercial success required cultural assumptions about cooperation, governmental support, and long-term planning that European business practices had never developed. The political intelligence he possessed about Asian kingdoms, their military capabilities, their internal conflicts, and their relationships with European territories should have been valuable to Venetian authorities whose commercial and diplomatic interests extended into regions where Chinese influence operated. Yet the very scope of his knowledge seemed to exceed credibility, while the implications of what he reported challenged European assumptions about their own importance within global political and economic systems. Officials who should have been eager to exploit his unique expertise instead treated his information as elaborate fiction designed to enhance his personal reputation through claims that could never be verified. The religious questions raised by his experiences proved equally difficult to resolve within European ecclesiastical frameworks. The sophisticated spirituality he had encountered among non-Christian peoples challenged assumptions about the relationship between salvation and doctrinal orthodoxy that were fundamental to European theological understanding. The moral behavior and intellectual achievements of Buddhist monks, Islamic scholars, and other non-Christian religious figures could not be easily reconciled with teachings that claimed exclusive access to divine truth for Christianity. Yet expressing such doubts openly would have invited charges of heresy that could have destroyed his social position entirely. The linguistic habits developed during years of thinking in Chinese created communication difficulties that affected even simple daily interactions. The directness of expression that was valued in Chinese administrative discourse seemed rude when applied to European social situations that required more elaborate courtesy. The precision of terminology that had been essential for effective governmental service seemed pedantic when applied to European conversations that emphasized emotional connection over accurate information transfer. Most fundamentally, the intellectual categories that had been shaped by Chinese philosophical traditions often lacked equivalent concepts in European languages, making exact communication of his thoughts impossible even when audiences were willing to listen carefully. The legal problems that arose from his prolonged absence and the wealth he had acquired overseas created additional complications for successful reintegration into European society. Property rights that had been maintained by relatives during his absence required legal resolution through courts whose procedures seemed primitive compared to Chinese administrative methods. Tax obligations related to his foreign income demanded calculations that European accounting practices were ill-equipped to handle accurately. Most seriously, the political relationships he had maintained with Asian rulers created potential conflicts of loyalty that European authorities viewed with suspicion, despite his attempts to demonstrate continued allegiance to Venetian interests. The marriage possibilities available to a man of his age and unconventional background proved limited by the very experiences that should have enhanced his attractiveness as a potential husband. Families whose daughters might have been suitable matches were concerned about his ability to provide stable domestic life after decades of foreign adventure. The cultural knowledge that had enabled his success in Asia seemed irrelevant to European domestic arrangements, while his wealth, impressive though it was, could not compensate entirely for doubts about his psychological suitability for conventional married life. When he finally did marry, the relationship required constant adjustment as he learned to apply interpersonal skills developed in Asian contexts to European domestic situations. The military conflict that erupted between Venice and Genoa in 1298 provided an unexpected opportunity for Marco to demonstrate his continued loyalty to his native city, while employing skills developed during his years of Asian service. His knowledge of large-scale logistics, his experience with diverse military technologies, and his understanding of strategic principles learned through observation of Chinese campaigns should have made him valuable as a military advisor. Instead, he found himself serving as a common naval officer aboard a Venetian galley whose capabilities seemed primitive compared to Chinese vessels he had traveled aboard during his years in imperial service. The battle that resulted in his capture by Genoese forces was decided by factors that Chinese military theory would have identified as crucial, but which Venetian commanders had failed to consider adequately. The intelligence-gathering failures, the coordination problems between different units, and the tactical mistakes that led to defeat would have been avoided by Asian military leaders whose training emphasized systematic preparation and careful analysis of enemy capabilities. Yet his attempts to suggest improvements were dismissed as theoretical speculation by professional soldiers whose practical experience was limited to European warfare methods. The prison in Genoa, where he spent the months following his capture, provided an environment that paradoxically proved more conducive to meaningful intellectual activity than the social obligations that had constrained him since his return to Venice. The enforced isolation created opportunities for systematic reflection on his extraordinary experiences that the demands of daily life in European society had made impossible. The other prisoners, many of whom possessed educational backgrounds and cultural interests that enabled genuine appreciation of unusual experiences, provided audiences more receptive to his stories than the skeptical merchants and relatives who had greeted his return to Venice. It was in this unlikely setting that Marco encountered Rustichello da Pisa, the romance writer whose literary skills would enable the preservation and transmission of experiences that might otherwise have remained locked within the mind of their sole European witness. Rustichello possessed the imaginative capacity necessary for understanding adventures that exceeded ordinary human experience, while his professional expertise in narrative construction enabled him to organize Marco's memories into coherent form that could engage readers whose own lives had been limited to conventional European boundaries. The collaboration that produced Il Milione required months of intensive work as Marco's memories were explored, organized, and translated into prose that could communicate Asian realities to European minds. The process demanded constant negotiation between accuracy and credibility, between comprehensive detail and narrative flow, between scholarly precision and popular accessibility. Rustichello's literary instincts had to be balanced against Marco's insistence on factual accuracy, while both men struggled with the challenge of describing experiences for which European languages lacked adequate vocabulary and European culture provided no appropriate contexts. The book that emerged from their collaboration was unlike anything European literature had ever attempted. It was simultaneously travel narrative and commercial manual, geographic study and cultural analysis, adventure story and governmental handbook. Its descriptions of Asian cities, customs, and commercial opportunities provided European readers with their first systematic introduction to civilizations whose existence had previously been matters of speculation rather than documented fact. More importantly, it demonstrated that the world was far larger, more diverse, and more sophisticated than European knowledge had ever suggested. Yet even as the book gained circulation and influenced European understanding of global geography, Marco found himself branded as a teller of tales rather than a reliable witness to historical truth. The very magnitude of what he reported exceeded European capacity for belief, while the implications of his experiences challenged assumptions about European superiority that were fundamental to medieval worldviews. Readers who enjoyed his stories as entertaining fiction were reluctant to accept them as accurate descriptions of contemporary realities, preferring to maintain comfortable illusions about European centrality within global civilization. The years that followed his release from prison and the publication of his book brought limited satisfaction despite the achievement of literary fame. The knowledge that had been preserved in written form would eventually influence European exploration and expansion, but the immediate response revealed how resistant established opinion could be to information that challenged fundamental assumptions. The commercial opportunities he had identified would eventually be exploited by later generations of European adventurers, but his contemporaries lacked the vision and resources necessary for taking advantage of possibilities that exceeded their imagination. The personal isolation that had begun with his return from Asia continued throughout his remaining years in Venice. The experiences that had shaped his understanding of human possibilities could not be shared meaningfully with people whose own lives had been constrained within European boundaries. The cultural knowledge that had enabled his success within Chinese imperial service seemed irrelevant to European social situations that operated according to entirely different principles. The very completeness of his transformation, which had been essential for survival and success during his Asian years, now prevented effective integration into the European society that should have honored him as its most accomplished explorer. The death that came to Marco Polo in 1324 marked the end of a life that had bridged civilizations in ways that no human being before him had achieved. The young Venetian, who had departed his native city in 1271, had been transformed through experiences that challenged every assumption European culture had provided about the nature of reality, the possibilities of human achievement, and the scope of divine creation. The man who died in Venice more than half a century later carried within his memory images of cities more magnificent than any European imagination could conceive, knowledge of governmental systems more sophisticated than any European example, and understanding of human diversity that exceeded anything European scholarship had ever attempted to catalog. The book that preserved his experiences would eventually reshape European understanding of global geography and inspire the voyages of discovery that would connect Europe with Asian markets through maritime routes that circumvented the overland passages that had made his own journey possible. Columbus would carry a copy of Marco Polo's descriptions when he sailed westward in search of the Asian kingdoms whose wealth and sophistication had been documented through Venetian eyes. The Portuguese navigators who eventually established direct maritime contact with Chinese civilization would compare their discoveries with the accounts that Marco had provided centuries earlier. Yet the immediate legacy of his extraordinary life was measured less in practical achievements than in the expansion of human possibility that his example represented. He had demonstrated that cultural boundaries were not absolute barriers to understanding, that individual adaptation could enable meaningful participation in alien civilizations, and that direct experience could challenge assumptions that had seemed unquestionable to minds that had never encountered alternatives. The boy who had learned to think like a Chinese while retaining his essential European identity had created a model of cross-cultural bridge building that would remain relevant as long as human societies struggled to understand each other across the barriers of language, custom, and belief. The stories that survived him would continue to inspire adventurers and dreamers for centuries to come, their power lying not merely in their descriptions of exotic places and peoples, but in their demonstration that ordinary human beings could transcend the limitations that birth and circumstance seemed to impose. Marco Polo's greatest achievement was not the distances he traveled or the wealth he acquired, but the proof he provided that the world was larger, more diverse, and more wonderful than any single culture could ever fully comprehend. In an age when most people lived and died within walking distance of their birthplace, he had shown that human horizons could be expanded to encompass the entire globe, and that such expansion brought not merely material rewards, but spiritual enrichment that justified every hardship endured along the way. The merchant son from Venice had become something unprecedented in human history, a citizen of the world whose very existence challenged the assumptions that kept civilization separate and ignorant of each other's achievements. His life stood as testament to the possibility that barriers between peoples were artificial constructions rather than natural laws, and that human beings possess the capacity to transcend their origins sufficiently to participate in the full diversity of human experience. In death, as in life, Marco Polo remained a bridge between worlds, his memory preserving connections that would outlast empires and inspire generations of adventurers who dreamed of following the paths he had pioneered into the unknown reaches of human possibility. That bridge, built from courage and curiosity, from suffering and wonder, from the simple willingness to see the world as it actually was rather than as inherited tradition claimed it must be, remains one of humanity's most precious achievements. Proof that no distance is too great, no difference too profound, no challenge too daunting to prevent human beings from reaching across the void that separates peoples and nations to touch the common core of wonder and hope that unites our species across every boundary that seems to divide us. Marco Polo died in Venice, but he had lived in the world.